So welcome to everyone as you're joining us today. I'm going to get started now. So hello and welcome to our NGO CSW, so non-governmental organizations, Status of Women Forum parallel event on gender-based violence in the climate crisis, shockproofing communities. My name is Anuradha Dugal. I'm the Vice President of Community Initiatives at Canadian Women's Foundation. And I'm going to get us started before I hand off things to the Foundation's President and CEO, Paulette Senior, who is our moderator for the event today. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the work of the Canadian Women's Foundation takes place on traditional First Nations, Métis, Inuit territories. We're very grateful for the opportunity to live, meet, work, and play on this land. However, we recognize that land acknowledgements are not enough. We need to pursue truth, reconciliation, decolonization, and allyship in an ongoing effort to make right with all our relations. If you don't know about us, Canadian Women's Foundation is a national leader in the movement for gender equality in Canada. Through funding, research, advocacy, and knowledge mobilization, we work to achieve systemic change. We support women, girls, and gender diverse people to move out of violence, out of poverty, and into confidence and leadership. Since 1991, our partners and donors have contributed more than $150 million to fund over 2,500 life-transforming programs throughout the country. There are some technical details. If you haven't already, please click the interpretation option at the bottom of your screen and select a language channel. We have interpreters today who are working to make sure that everyone's words are understood. So please select English or French to ensure a seamless experience for you. There is captioning available in both English and French. To access the English, please enable on your Zoom toolbar. At the bottom, there's a little button that you can use to enable CC, closed captioning. To access the French, please click the link in the chat, which I think somebody is just popping in there now. I don't see it yet. So I'll just wait a couple of minutes for that. So I'm just going to go through that again because I can see the CC live transcript is up on the bottom of the Zoom screen. Sorry, I was having a complete blank about what word that was. The Zoom screen. And you can, that's for the English closed captioning. If you're looking for French closed captioning, the link is now in the chat. If you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A box, also at the bottom of your screen, at any time. We will monitor this box and pose your questions at the end of the session. Of course, we'll do our best to get to as many as possible. If you have any tech issues, please feel free to write a note in the chat box, and we will do our best to deal with anything so that you can get online, you'll get the help you need. So I'm now going to hand things over to Paulette Senior to start us off on the panel discussion. Thank you so much, Paulette, and welcome.
Thank you so much, Anu, and thank you for using a pace in your speaking that reminds us all that this session is being translated in many different ways. And so we just need to be mindful of that. And I guess this is my ever so gentle way of reminding our esteemed panelists as well. But before we get to them, thank you Anuradha, for opening our space and getting us started on this important conversation. As we kind of get into UNCSW, I'm excited because it's not normal for me to not be physically in the CSW space, sort of cavorting and collaborating and planning with sisters from around the country and around the globe on CSW. So this event is virtual, yet still very much important, and allows us to continue our connections. It is part of the NGO CSW forum, and so excited to be in that conversation, in that space, albeit virtual again. The forum is an annual event in which women's movement and gender justice leaders and advocates from around the world gather in New York City. That has been our norm for decades. The goal is to make sure that governments meeting inside the UN remember that their deliberations about gender equity affect real live people. And even though we can't show up in numbers in person as we typically would, we continue to build our movements using online tools such as this today that are available to us. So thank you to everyone who is joining us virtually. It allows us to continue and to keep having these conversations. This year, the government deliberations at UNCSW are all about the disproportionate gendered impacts of climate change and environmental disasters. This conversation is urgent and couldn't be more timely. We are rounding out 2 years of living with responding to a global pandemic. Women, trans, and non-binary people have been hardest hit, especially those who are further marginalized by anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism, ageism, and ableism, discrimination based on immigration status, as well as poverty. In addition to significant economic losses, we have seen gender-based violence rates increase substantially. And this has been recognized globally as a shadow pandemic. At the Canadian Women's Foundation, we've been talking a lot about how little surge capacity the gender-based violence sector in Canada has. How can assault centers and gender-based violence services respond to the predictable increase in violence in a time of community-wide crisis when they are already working on shoestring budgets, relying on outdated infrastructure, and trying their best to accommodate service waitlists? Along with many leaders in the women's and gender justice sector, we are asking some key questions, including, what does it look like to shockproof the sector? And what does it mean to shockproof our communities against gender-based violence in times of community-wide crisis? Connection to climate change and climate justice have taught us many lessons, including lessons learned from the pandemic, for instance, about the need for a well-funded women's sector and the need to address the systemic root causes of violence. And these are important to consider in light of the climate crisis that is that is near and present and sitting on our doorsteps. In the climate justice environment, and to some extent in academia, a lot has been said about the gendered impacts of climate change. This, we know, is particularly the case in the context of the developing world, where some countries like Bangladesh and the Pacific Island nations have been dealing with climate emergencies for decades. In Canada, there are strong women, trans, and non-binary leaders within the climate justice space, with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit women who have been and are leading the way. However, within Canada's women's and gender justice movement, the links between gender-based violence and the climate crisis have not been explored so explicitly. So we see UNCSW this year as an important opportunity to start us on a path of learning and strengthening ties across the climate and gender justice movements right here in Canada. So today, we've invited 3 exceptional panelists to speak to us about their direct experiences as service providers and activists. They will speak to the gendered impacts of climate events that have affected their communities and how this connects to the broader conversations about gender justice. So let me start with some introductions of these exceptional panelists. Let's start with them telling us a bit about who they are, the community that they're part of, and what brings them to this conversation today. So I'm going to begin with Yas. And Yas, would you mind just taking the floor and sharing with us who you are? And then we'll go to Amy and followed by Lynette.
Great. Thank you so much for those beautiful introductions and grounding us in this context and in our session today. My name is Yaz. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm a Black non-binary person who's based in Toronto. I've been doing climate and gender justice work at the intersections of anti-poverty work, as well as the Black liberation movement for quite some time. A lot of this work came through growing up in Rexdale, which is a lower income community in North Etobicoke in the city, and it is predominantly Black. And I've been seeing a lot of neighborhood change in Black geographies in the city and beyond, and did my master's research on the impacts of gentrification on Black neighborhoods here in the city, as well as just what we are seeing, and have really just centered my work around finding ways in which we can really increase community resistance to this problem and connecting this directly back to the roots of the Euro-American expansionist project of anti-Blackness, and figuring out ways in which we can negotiate geographies as the times change. But yeah, and I'm currently working and work with Community Knowledge Exchange, which is a social change organization that is kind of based virtually, but our hub is in Ottawa. And some of you may know of us, and I'm the manager there of program development and facilitation. And really my work is centered around our cohort, which we do called Cohort X, and that brings together around 6 community leaders who just are doing their work at these intersections of exactly climate and gender justice. And we want to create a space for them to rest and build and be resourced. So that's me. I will pass it off to the next panelist. Thank you.
Why don't we go to Amy? Thanks. Thank you, Yas.
Hi. Thank you so much for inviting me to join on this exciting panel discussion. I'm Amy Mckenzie from the Slocan Valley of the beautiful Kootenay Boundary region of British Columbia. I serve and support women, trans, and non-binary people, youth, and individuals experiencing marginalization in the remote community of Slocan Valley and the rural area of Castlegarden District. I would like to acknowledge my respect and deep gratitude for the First Nations of the West Kootenay Boundary region, the Snakes, the Celiacs, the Kootenai, and the Shuswap peoples, on whose traditional territories I am honored to raise my daughter, live, work, and play. I am an outreach worker serving women, trans, and non-binary individuals at risk for having experienced sexualized violence or gender-based violence. The women and individuals I serve are often coping with the ongoing challenges and perpetual stress of living in poverty. I work at Castlegar District Community Services Society, a nonprofit organization which houses many programs and supporting community members in need or at risk in various capacities. Lovely to be here.
Glad to have you, Amy. And over to you, Lynette.
Thank you so much. It is a true honor to be here today. My name is Lynette Selden, and my pronouns are she and her, and I've worked in the social services field for over 25 years. I live in Calgary, Alberta, and work at Rowan House, which is a rural community named High River, Alberta. I work and live in the territory of Treaty 7. Throughout my career, I have supported individuals and their families that are experiencing family violence and abuse through counseling, safety planning, case planning, and navigation of community resources that will help build their formal and informal supports. Supporting individuals and their families to increase their sense of safety, resiliency, and dignity is key through the collaboration of partnerships. Partnerships assist in seamless client service delivery and improves access to services for individuals and their families experiencing family violence and abuse. Gender-based violence is a persistent and prevalent problem, which increases specifically during stress, trauma, and prolonged climate crisis, which makes women, children, and individuals vulnerable to all types of violence and abuse. I really do look forward to hearing the rest of the panels today. Thank you again for having me.
Thank you, Lynette, and thank you all. So we're just going to launch right into our discussion today. And I have lined up a few questions to just get us started. And I'm going to direct the questions to you, and then we can just get right into the conversation. So to start us off, we'd like to hear from you about the climate events that have happened in your community. So let's start with you, Amy. We know that the BC interior has been severely affected by wildfires in recent years, most notably in the past year. Can you please share with us what that has looked like in Castlegar and what has responding to those emergencies looked like from your organization?
Yeah, sure. Over the last decade, really, our community experiences annual events of extreme heat, poor air quality, weather systems of smoke, and wildfires. These events participate evacuation alerts, evacuations, poor air quality health advisories, and cause an increase of stress to individuals and families living in the area. These events are becoming more frequent each year. During these events, our organization and its staff have to prioritize health and safety. During these climate events, some of our programs and services are interrupted as resources are focused on the preservation of life and informing and assisting clients to follow public health and safety orders. During a climate crisis, staff would assist women, trans, and non-binary individuals and families to evacuate, stay safe at home, and maintain food security.
Thank you, Amy. So over to you, Lynette. So we know that you're coming to us from an area of Alberta that has been affected by severe flooding a few years back. Many of us know about that. Share with us like the emergency response that was undertaken, what that looked like for you then, and how has that experience affected your community in the years since?
Thank you so much, Paulette. I'm going to start off with just giving a little bit of some information about High River. So High River is a people-first community with opportunities to enjoy the outdoors year-round. High River is a town within the Calgary metropolitan of Alberta. The population is over 14,000 residents that thrive on innovation, creativity, and appreciating all that life has to offer. The population is higher with females, and locals over 65 years of age represent the largest group. Additionally, married people account for the highest resident pool. Floods in parts of southern Alberta happened in June 2013, which caused billions of dollars in damage in High River, one of the hardest hit communities. Entire neighborhoods stood underwater for weeks. Nearly all the communities, 12,000 residents, were forced out of their homes. The flood of 2013 has been known as the summer of angry rivers, unprecedented flooding, and undeniable human spirit. The flood began in southern Alberta on June 20th and led to 5 deaths, billions of dollars in damage, and more than 100,000 people fleeing their homes to escape raging waters. It was known as a time where neighbors helped neighbors, strangers helped strangers, and Albertans vowed to recover come hell or high river. I'm not sure if everybody's heard that saying, but that was something that was really prominent during that period of time.
I do recall that.
Yeah. Originally, Rowan House was located in Black Diamond, Alberta. However, it was determined that a larger facility was needed. In 2013, we moved Rowan House, which is an emergency shelter for individuals who are experiencing family violence and abuse, to High River. 11 months after opening in our new location, we were hit by the June flood. We had over 3 feet of water in our emergency shelter floor and lost all of the children's center area, our staff area, and programming space, including a multi-sensory room and our spiritual room. Rowan House immediately followed the emergency preparedness plan. We used our emergency notification system to advise all staff members who were employed at Rowan House, and then advised and supported clients. It was hands all on deck. During this period of time, Rowan House connected to other shelters for support. And just to let everybody know, we're pretty connected here as an emergency shelter to help individuals who are in need, especially during crisis. Having these strong partnerships and community support was vital to ensure safety of the clients and staff team. We were quickly able to plan a safe place for each of our clients to reside while still keeping in touch with them, and to make sure that there were safe processes in place. Additionally, we provide transportation for each client to ensure that they were in their new safe location. Each client was provided with a 911 cell phone, as well as we continued to keep our crisis line available and rotated with the staff. Each staff had an opportunity to support. The other thing that I feel is also really important is that after 2 months, Rowan House was able to reopen. However, we could no longer use our lower floor at that time, and we had to operate in a smaller scale until construction of the building was complete. Through the support of our community, our funders, and just the general public, we were fully able to reopen, and we were stronger than ever by January 2014. We were able to receive more funding, and were able to secure more beds for the individuals who were experiencing family violence and abuse. Additionally, despite the devastation that High River had experienced, as well as the uplifting of our clients, one of the biggest things is we were still able to operate our outreach community program, and they were still able to find safe locations to meet clients outside of the shelter space. As of today, High River is approximately 80% complete in rebuilding. The downtown has been redesigned, and the community is the most flood-proof in Canada, they have advised us. So that is really good news. The population of High River is approximately 1,000 people higher than when the flood hit. Also, business licenses is also higher than it was before the flood hit in 2013.
So Lynette, you have so much that we can learn from, and so good to know about that you're the most flood-proof community in Canada. I would think that your phones are going to ring off the hook after that. So that's great. And so folks may be wondering why Yas is not a part of this part of the conversation. I have a whole bunch of other questions for you, Yas. So we'll be coming to you in a moment. But I wanted to sort of flip back to Amy and note that the impact, think about the impact of the wildfires, which are now basically seemingly an annual event. Can you, Amy, then share with us how this affects the women, trans, and non-binary people that you work with, and how does it impact them differently in your community?
Yeah, as you say, these are becoming somewhat of an annual event. And I think it's important to kind of imagine the scenario in a crisis. Often public health and safety orders are carried out by RCMP and other persons of authority. And marginalized folk often feel threatened or stigmatized or vulnerable in the presence of these figures. So we at our agency have built trusting relationships with these folks and can bridge that distrust, supporting regulation and reason, avoid further traumatization, disruption, and increased risk to safety. Food security is an ongoing challenge for women and marginalized individuals. And during these events, food banks and other services are often suspended or hard to get to. So during these events, having knowledge and connection with these people in our community allows our staff to reach out to them on an individual level to support them to buy food and basic supplies, even when our clients have been temporarily relocated outside community, which often is the case. And when you consider that that people are often temporarily relocated, they may not always be reaching out to family or individuals that are safe environments to go to. So that is another area of concern when marginalized people are evacuated. Many low-income families, women, trans, and non-binary individuals rely on public transit in our community. And during a climate event, many women many women are dependent on others for mobility, leaving them at risk during these crises. Another thing to consider is during a poor air quality advisory, people's mobility is limited, and there is an increase of situations of isolation, especially for women with small children. Women living in poverty have no means often to buy air purification systems or cooling units, resulting in poor living conditions and an increased risk to health and safety. Many women rely on the hospitality industry in our area, which has been negatively affected because of these annual events, and interruptions to employment threatens their ability to maintain basic human survival. As a result of these events, there is an increased stress on all members of the community and its infrastructure, creating disruptions in services available during a crisis, which results in less support available to those in need and those at risk of or experiencing violence. There is an increased risk of mental health concerns during these climate events, which produce an increased level of disruption, isolation, anxiety, and fear. This increase in stress can increase the risk for violence towards women, trans, and non-binary people at a time when resources are limited and less accessible.
Thank you, Amy. And Lynette, I saw you sort of vigorously shaking your head because I'm assuming that similar things happen in your community, and maybe you can just take us through how your service providers were impacted.
Absolutely. And you're absolutely right, Amy. You hit all the important stuff. So thank you. Firstly, during a natural disaster, it is important to support the staff. And that's something that we had to do at Rowan House immediately by creating awareness by what trauma is, how each person can be affected differently, and how each individual responds and interprets traumatic events. In order to support clients, we have to be able to regulate our own body reactions and emotions by being aware of our own personal triggers and responses, and to be able to regulate in the moment or prior to engaging with clients who are also going through some major traumatic experiences. It is a challenge if we cannot provide safety and ensure no harm is done to clients if we're not present in our own mind and body. During the flood, 2/3 of our staff were personally impacted. Some of the staff have also lost their homes and were concerned about some of their next steps and also their families. This was a very challenging time as well, as they also knew that we had to rebuild Rowan House and what their work employment was going to look like for themselves. During the flood, many of the women and children experienced further trauma, specifically feeling forced displacement. Clients had left their home due to family violence and abuse, and again had to leave, which was now on top of it, leaving High River, a community that they were very comfortable in. All the unknowns added further stress, concerns for their safety was elevated, and many expressed feeling overwhelmed and scared. The instability of the situation added to clients second-guessing their decisions of leaving their partner and how this could impact their children moving forward. Many clients were concerned about their home that they had left, as well as how that was going to impact them if they decided to return. Many clients were concerned if they still had employment, how they would support themselves financially, as well as their children. It was felt that existing social structures that normally lessened violence, such as law enforcement, schools, health, and support systems, were also impaired during this period of time. At times, our clients felt dislocated from resources and social support systems, which was really problematic and again added to their further stress.
Thank you both so much for carrying us through that and sort of painting that picture of what the impact is on your organizations, as well as on the folks that depend on the services you provide. So painting that picture of that intersection between climate justice as well as gender justice work. So now I'm going to move on to Yas, as promised. And Yas, I'm going to ask you to take some time to talk about this from your location, from your perspective. So building on what Amy and Lynette have both said about the disproportionate impact of climate change on their service users, we'd like to hear from you about your experience working at the intersection of climate and gender justice conversations that's been happening.
Yeah, no, thank you both, Amy and Lynette, also for sharing those experiences and those reflections. Yeah, I think to build on what you were both talking about, one thing I think that it's like very important to name, which has kind of been like, we've been all kind of talking about this, especially in like the community organizing spaces I occupy and am within, is just starting from the ground, like the baseline of saying that like this climate crisis is rooted at the intersections of like colonialism, white supremacy, capitalism, the patriarchy, and how these systems of oppression have had these long lasting and ever evolving ways that have led to this climate crisis, I think is a really good and important grounding place to kind of like base everything else that I'll be saying on. And when we say that, I think sometimes folks, those are all like big scary words, and it's like, oh, but how does the climate crisis related to these things? And I think what is vitally important is to talk about the ways in which like this country was formed and whose land we are on and how these resources got extracted, who has had access to things like intergenerational wealth, who has had access to just like all of these different resources, and who's been extracting them. And it goes back down to those systems of oppression. We think about the way in which like the RCMP has like invested their like resourcing into the big oil industry. Their pensions are dependent on it, right? And so when this, like when our systems and when our policies are so greatly intertwined with some of these things that actually need to be shifted to address the climate crisis, it's going to be slow and we're going to face a lot of barriers. And so as especially like since 2020, I've been doing this since before that and like have been in community with folks who've been doing this for generations and for years. But especially since like the onset of the pandemic, we're just seeing a lot of this exacerbated. And like, I don't like, you've already both like talked about the ways in which this is affecting your communities. And like one of the things that isn't being built into account, especially as we think about the pandemic, is the way in which long COVID is affecting folks. And even like the validity of non-COVID or long COVID is something that is like often debated. And like just the traumas that have come with like having COVID, for having to experience all of these different disasters and crises at the same time in such a short amount of time as well. Thinking about just like what has happened in the last 2 years in and of itself is like so much to like navigate and really witness, especially for young people as you're kind of growing into this and trying to find your footing, and then just being like shoved with all of these crises all at once and it kind of all coming to a bubble. I think, again, it's really important for folks to have that intergenerational exchange, which I think at the beginning of the pandemic, we saw a lot of emphasis, of course, on like youth movements. And this is not to take away from youth movements, because I think they're really, really important. And like, I'm a younger person, but I think there needs to be a shift. And we've been hearing that there needs to be a shift to more of an intergenerational movement. And that is because a lot of these crises, if you're like over the age of 30, you've seen before in different forms, or you've seen these disasters take shape again in different ways. And so how can we start learning from these movements, and how can our movements become irresistible, as a lot of movement leaders say, in a way that interconnects all of us? And I think that is by centering Black and Indigenous, like women, trans, and non-binary folks, and listening to them, right? It's not just like, okay, we're gonna put you as the new like managing director or the new whatever, and now you're gonna take care of it. And because you're Black, our problems are solved, right? It's thinking about ways in which we can like set these folks up for success. And that's something that we've been really thinking about with our cohort, because like I was saying earlier in my introduction, we're bringing together 6 community leaders from coast to coast in this so-called country. And these folks are all either women or gender diverse folks. They're all BIPOC and have been doing this work at the intersections of climate and gender justice for quite some time. And if you know people who are doing this work, and as I'm sure you both have experienced, or we all have experienced, a lot of that work is undervalued. A lot of that work is unpaid. A lot of that work is like not even a choice, right? Like if you are Black living in poverty, or you're Indigenous living on a reserve that doesn't have clean drinking water, this isn't just a theory. This is not just like a concept. You're actually facing the true like impacts of your livelihood because of this crisis that we're in, and the multiple intersecting crises that we're in. So with that being said, as we bring together these 6 folks, which in and of itself is it feels like such a limited number, but to get resourcing is often really difficult for this kind of work, because our cohort is a like non-output driven. So these folks are getting a stipend of $12,000 for a 9-month program in which all you're being asked to do is truly rest. Like if you want to build relationships, if you want to be involved in like the the workshop offerings and the program deliveries, but everything is pretty optional in that sense, and everything is based on like what these folks need to rest. And to build a program like this is really, really important, and something we keep hearing as we move into the second version of this program is just how there isn't enough programs like this. And oftentimes when you're asked to be a part of something that will support in your growth or support in your leadership, you're asked to like do like a 30-page document outlining these things, or you're asked to kind of like extract your trauma to like get this funding, right? And I think that in and of itself leads to this very cyclical issue within the nonprofit sphere of really using folks for their trauma, and using that as a way to get money, and using that as a way to get like credibility, or to get even just like folks listening to you, right? So how can we move away from that more extractive element when folks are already going through so much extraction because of these crises, and more into a place of rest and ease? And how can we normalize that, I think has been a really big thing on our minds right now. So I can leave it there because I'm feeling like I'll lose the plot the more I talk. So a second question would be great, and I'm happy to expand.
Listen, I could listen to that forever. You dropped some gems there around, extraction, looking at extraction in a much different way, and no matter how you extract, it's having an impact, so extracting people's trauma and in order to get the funds to do the work that sometimes is caused by extraction. The links are so good. So thank you for that, and thank you for bringing that to the fore in a real way and making the links. And so my second question for you is just asking you to share with us about the slogan. Sorry, I'm just messing my notes here. Share us about the slogan and the link between climate justice and gender justice, and what other movements are doing about this in Canada in terms of the social justice movements. The slogan being systems change, not climate change. So with this in mind, just share with us about that, and how do these visions for social justice actually fit together?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I thank you again for that question. I think, firstly, I think because of the things I just named earlier, that the gender justice and climate justice like spheres are inherently interconnected, and that is something that both Amy and Lynette kind of touched on a lot as well. Just like anytime, like you said, like you see a crisis, and a climate crisis especially, you will see gender-based violence go up. And we see that especially with the pandemic too. But I think, calling on like that slogan, system change, not climate change, and that call to action is really important, because again, it's really addressing that piece around that this is not just like a theory or a concept. It's not super far off in the distance. It's now, and it's happening. And who it's affecting is based off different privileges, and based off the ways in which like different people's like livelihoods are interconnected to these things. So folks who are in rural and remote areas, again, are seeing these impacts a lot more than sometimes folks living in cities, or people in the global south are seeing the impacts faster than people who are in the global north or like Western locations. So I think systems change in and of itself is very important. But when we think about the systems change, it's also thinking about like who, like I said before, is at the front of this movement, and how we actually can do it. Because a problem that like I have encountered like time and time again, particularly in community like grassroots led spaces, is just like an issue of taking, I guess there's two issues. There's one of urgency, which we want to like combat, because like everything is happening now and we need to move quick. It feels like that. But then the other is if we move too quick, then we forget about relationships, we forget to build trust, we forget to do that deep work. So you're always caught in this balance of like, what are we doing right now? How can we build relationships, but also address something that just happened yesterday in the encampments, or like that just happened on like Wet'suwet'en territory, right? So when we think about system change, and something that we've been thinking a lot in the cohort program is just how that starts in relationship, and how that actually starts in community, and building your community and knowing your neighbors. Because as we think about the impacts of climate change and the climate crisis, things like the internet might cease to exist one day. And we have to be really real about that. And how are we actually connecting with each other as a way to have these like ecologies of care in which folks are able to show up for each other. And as we see things like gentrification or developments on like Tyendinaga land that were attempted, you're seeing these attempts to break communities and break Black and Indigenous and racialized communities. And the issue there is because not only like the obvious reasons why we don't want those communities to be broken, but also as folks are being displaced, you lose those, like I said earlier, those ecologies of care where maybe you have an auntie in the neighborhood who always looks after your kids like when you can't work, because there isn't proper like established childcare services in northern areas sometimes, or in even the city, right? And if you take people out of those places and now you're kind of dropped into a new location and displace them, you lose those elements. You lose like these after school programs that are like informally established in communities, or you lose folks like showing up for each other and safety plans when a community member is not doing well, right? And so I think a lot of that system change has to be rooted in the community work we're doing. And then as we do that, we can address the policy issues and we can address the climate crisis because they kind of go hand in hand. But without a relationship and without trust, we are doomed to fail. Like it's impossible to build and change systems when we can't trust in each other and work together in a ethical and care-centered and accountability-centered way. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Oh, yeah, it does. And wow. And I'm sure both Amy and Lynette would agree that making that link between how we go about building systems change, but also having to respond to, but that is built on what you call ecologies of care. Like that's just amazing. This morning, I was talking to a peer of mine from another foundation, talking about foundation of care. And this afternoon, I'm talking about ecologies of care. So clearly, we need communities that are built on care, and to build that into the systems that we rely on for our daily living, but also for the future that we're building towards. So that's great. Thank you. So now I'm going to bring all three of you together in the next question. So we know that we can't always foresee or prevent any single climate disaster, but we also know that gender-based violence increases and women's livelihoods are adversely affected in times of community stress. So starting with Lynette, what is one thing that you would like to see happen to help shockproof your community against the predictable impacts on women, trans, and non-binary folks when an emergency strikes?
I'm going to say that I still feel as much as we can be preventative and build those strong connections. I love what you said, Yaz. It was amazing and beautiful, just so you know. But I feel prevention at both the policy level and on the ground. One thing I know is domestic violence programs tend to be scaled back during a natural disaster due to damages of sites, evacuation of employees. However, data suggests it is critical that the opposite occurs. We need to make sure that there's emergency funding for domestic violence and shelters. So that way women will have a safe place to go, or to look at some options such as hotels or a safe family member, really building on those formal and informal supports. Financial consequences of natural disasters may exacerbate the risk. I can't talk, I apologize. Additionally, access to gender-sensitive trauma-informed counseling, I think, is also pivotal. And so we sometimes, when something is occurring, we're kind of there in the moment and we're addressing it. And then we start to shift into the kind of the recovery stage, is what we generally use as terminology. And that is when we sometimes forget that that's when individuals may need the most support, is after the situation has occurred. And a lot of times that isn't happening. So really wanting to make sure that that is provided always for our individuals and the community. Overall trauma for women and girls is likely to go beyond the natural disaster itself. So appropriate relief is critical to mitigating this additional disaster. Further professionals need to be trained to be sensitive to working with women and girls in relation to gender-based violence. And I cannot stress that enough. And that will be across our community. If it's police officers, doctors and nurses, schools, across the board, I think is very, very important.
Thank you for that, Lynette. And thank you for re-emphasizing the importance of focusing on recovery as one of the most critical elements, because Yas before referenced the impact of long COVID and having to actually convince folks that that's a real thing because it's questioned. And now you're talking about recovery. And sometimes we think we use the phrase as if it's supposed to cover all things. but you know, the impact can be different depending on who the person is and what they are having to, you know, climb out of or come through, overcome, all of that, right? So you know, it's one of the things that we talk to government about is that we need, and that's why we came up with this term shockproof. Like, how do we actually work at a community level, at an organizational level as well, to shockproof communities so that they're well-resourced, to be flexible and nimble as needed, and that because a disaster happens, such as what we've experienced, or even this pandemic, that these organizations and communities have that ability to respond as needed in their community because they've been well-resourced along the way. So thank you for that. And over to you, Amy.
Hi, yes, I really appreciated that ecology of care. That's paints a really good image, and I think that's something that could go a long way in prevention of shockproofing, creating strength in community networks with women, trans, and non-binary people, empowering women to have those people to reach out and make those connections in the event where the internet is not accessible. You have that auntie or neighbor that you can reach out to and connect with. I think having more resources focused on implementing formal support systems that can be quickly activated during a crisis to support and empower women would improve the community's overall ability to respond and maintain health and safety and recover. I think recovery is an important part to look at as well. But services are needed during the crisis and throughout into recovery. Having access to resources during a climate event would allow our organization to respond from the bottom up, having knowledge of the clients, their needs, and their immediate situations. Having knowledge of and relationships with women and people at risk in our community, we can identify and respond to their needs directly. As a grassroots organization, we can use our existing relationships with at-risk community members to facilitate connection, promote regulation, and assist other relevant response services during a climate event by creating a multidisciplinary response with emergency services such as the RCMP and creating a trauma-informed response. we can improve the community's response overall and create a network of support for women and marginalized folks to improve communities' response in a climate event and foster resiliency.
Thank you so much, Amy, and thank you for making those links for us. The knowledge piece that you emphasize, knowledge of the community, knowledge of the people that you work with, is really what is critical in terms of being able to respond. And that's why you talked about a bottom-up approach as part of that work, because that's where people's lives have been impacted. And so being able to do that based on the knowledge that you've gathered and know about your community, that's why organizations have to be funded on the ground in order to do that. So thank you for emphasizing that. And so being able to create and build networks that can be strengthened at the community level, and work together as a network to be able to respond as well, is what you mentioned. So thank you. And last but not least, over to you, Yas.
Yes, thank you all for those sharings. And I also want to make sure to name that I did not invent the term ecology.
I hope we didn't lose Yas. Are you there? I think she was saying that she did not invent the term, but she certainly brought it to this conversation. So that's really great. She may have to sign back on. Yes, I know that's what happens, is that usually you have to leave Zoom and come back on. So we'll just give her a minute to rejoin us. There she is. And if we could pin her so she can come back into the conversation, that would be great. There she is. Over to you, Yas. I filled the space, Yas.
Thank you. Also, just a reminder, I use they, them pronouns, but thank you for filling space. Sorry about my internet connection there.
Thank you for correcting me. I appreciate that.
No, thank you. Sorry, just to reground. Just building off what you both were saying, I think also something that we need to see as these crises will most likely, because we're in a climate crisis that is ongoing and won't stop with the pandemic, won't stop with each hope of new year bringing more ease, right? It's prevalent and it's happening. I think we need to be listening to folks who have been saying since time immemorial around this work, but aka Indigenous folks, and Black folks and disabled folks around ways in which we can implement a just transition, and a way in which we can implement these community-based interventions into our communities, and moving away from these institutions to help us with these crises, right? And I think institutional backing is important in regards to wide scale crisis response. But again, I think community level work is the most important to actually have a just and shock-proof, like you're saying, way to respond to these things. Because as much as I may be working with certain folks, or you may be working with certain folks, people in community know their community the best, and they know what is going on, they know where the gaps are. And so I think we really need to lean on that community knowledge also as well. Just really starting to value embodied and lived experience as something that is a value, I think is really important, because often we look for these credentials to give people the credit to lead our movement spaces or to lead us in a certain direction. But how can we move towards trusting people and trusting each other who have gone through these experiences as a way to learn and move towards a better crisis response or when emergency strikes. And a lot of that has to do with redistribution of wealth. Another huge thing we've been seeing as the pandemic has happened is I guess, the understanding of mutual aid becoming more and more prevalent in our spaces. But I think that needs to be like continued and not just stopped as the pandemic maybe feels like it's starting to lessen, or as these crises like are being resolved. I think what you're saying around preventative pieces, I agree. It's less about preventative and more as like, how can we integrate these system changes into our work? So it's not preventative anymore. It's actually just like a normalization of how we can care for each other and how we will show up in these moments. And redistribution of wealth is a huge part of that, because a lot of folks are not able to access their basic, like their basic structural and social determinants of health during these times, but also during times of like non-crises. So how can we make better systems in which like folks don't have to get like overwhelmed by increasing renting prices or increasing like if you aren't able to move out of your house, then you might stay in a situation where domestic violence is happening, and that is linked to like the housing crisis in a lot of places, and that is linked to gender-based violence, right? And so yeah, all that to say, I think it needs to be, I agree with what Lynette was saying, less about preventative and more as integrated system change. Yeah.
Wow, this has been a truly engaging, enlightening, exciting conversation with all three of you. Thank you so much for taking the time to add to our own sort of deepening knowledge about making the links between climate justice and gender justice. It's an area that we've been thinking about in terms of our work at the Kenya Women's Foundation for the past few years, is how do we do that in a way that demonstrates that inextricable link between the two. And I think the recent events, climate events that have happened, as well as the pandemic that's happened, has demonstrated to us how critical that is in terms of supporting amazing organizations like your own that's doing the work, that's seeing the links, you have no choice but to work on these multiples of levels in order to respond to what the community needs, not just based on your slice of seeing the world within one perspective and not the other. So thank you for bringing that to life with us. Thank you for sharing your expertise and your passion, but also what the challenge is around that. Thank you, Yas, for talking about the importance of valuing the lived experience, the importance of trust as a critical element for community building, and how important that is in being able to respond, and then building on the next point around moving from prevention to just how we show up, right? To just do the work. That is just like, I don't know, I'm a little inspired, maybe a bit too passionate, but thank you for bringing that forward. I so appreciate you. I appreciate all you bring. And thanks for kicking us off in this conversation today. Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Lynette. Thank you, Yas. I'm now going to hand it over to Anu.
And thank you, Paulette. Thank you very much for taking us through that incredible conversation. I am going to just continue a little bit of the wrap up that Paulette has started to really tie it back to some of the key ideas that I think emerged, and just sort of bring how the things that you shared together about what you had experienced. So I think one of the things, and I think the point that emergencies are emergencies, whether they're a climate emergency or a pandemic or a different kinds of community events too, is another thing to think about within this circle. Of course, we want to focus on climate, and we will, but we know that in any community crisis, gender-based violence will increase. And we know that as soon as that crisis hits, we have to have a system that is ready to deal with the surge capacity. So I heard very strongly that sufficient resources need to be activated very, very quickly, and that needs to be built into the system. So not that it's an addition or a tag on, or suddenly somebody's going to allow this to happen, but that it's established from the beginning so that services aren't suspended, and so that organizations like yourselves really expand to deal with the full, I guess, the extent of the emergency. So food security, housing, forced displacement, as well as temporary relocation, I mentioned food security, but all the way to the losses and the concerns that people have for their families, their homes, their communities, as workers, as well as community members. And I think that's an important thing that we must also highlight. And I think I heard you say throughout your conversations was that while people who are using the services that you provide are often seen as, you know, participants, clients, they are the community, they are your community, they are the people you are working for, with, together. The separation gets much, much thinner in an emergency too. And I think that's really important to understand. We do this work because we care passionately, and often because we're survivors and we want to be there to help others in the way that we know that help has been there for us. And I think that's another important part of saying, when we build this economy of care, the ecology of care, sorry, the ecology of care really is built around the ways in which we care for each other because of the work we do. I really appreciated the reminder about mobility issues, because I think that's not often brought through, whether it's women, trans or non-binary people living with disabilities, or whether it's simply the lack of availability of certain kinds of mobility and transportation in some communities. That's incredibly important. And I think one of the things that I heard many times was experiencing several disasters at the same time in a kind of stacked way, which then means, you know, rebuilding takes years and takes many, many forms. And all of the rebuilding efforts then have to be trauma informed. So I think that's a reminder to communities too, the municipalities, the cities, the towns, the provinces that we live in physically, that there has to be an awareness of the impact of gender-based violence at any emergency. And then there has to be a trauma-informed piece to the rebuilding and the recovery, as well as the gender-based analysis or the intersectional analysis that happens at all times, we hope, happens on our end. And we want to encourage everyone to take that up. So maybe I'll just hope that that's reminded everybody about all of the different things we touched on. I know that there are some questions in the chat. Please continue to add questions if you have them in the chat. I can maybe start with the first one. This is maybe to Lynette and Amy. And this is a way to connect perhaps your experiences in the pandemic to your experiences in the climate-related emergencies. Can you think of things that, like across the board, you learned that can help you respond to a climate-related emergency that perhaps we picked up, especially in the pandemic? And knowing how unpredictable things are, I know that's hard to try and point to, but maybe one or two things that you could really point to there. And then Yaz, I have a question for you after that.
I think I've already just spoken to the availability of resources to react quickly using the knowledge and connection we have with community members to be able to respond quickly and have what we need at our disposal at that time. Definitely that was something that our organization and myself personally learned throughout the last 2 years working with the pandemic.
I echo what Amy said. I think the other thing that was very much top of mind is the importance of also, if you are a social services kind of agency and you're providing support to individuals that are already experiencing trauma, the importance of making sure that the team that is supporting those individuals is also receiving really positive and ongoing support as well. During the pandemic, some of the agencies were able to shift to work from home, which some people celebrate and love, and doesn't always work for everybody. But we started to see, as we were hitting, our second year, that some of the mental health of the individuals that were providing counseling or providing case management and support were also having their own struggles. Sometimes we hear some pretty difficult and challenging stories from our clients, and now your personal life your professional life is now in your home. So it's really important to somehow find ways that are safe to unpack and have your safe spot at your house as well. So I think those are some of the things that I think are important to address, have really strong conversations about, but to also make sure that the team that you're supporting is also having opportunities to talk and to receive support as well. So we can continue to do the great work that we do with the individuals that we're supporting, I think is also key. And then also concur with exactly what Amy was saying about the resources, and we can't do this work alone. So if we're able to really gather those support systems in a different way, but I think also tapping into our clients and talking to them about who they see as important in their life and who they might be able to bring forward and have a conversation with, and how can they support them through this process, I think is also important. And I think, yeah, as you mentioned this, that sometimes we forget about those informal supports, but those are pivotal for everybody. So really tapping into that in a different way.
Thank you so much. That's great. And I think really important points to raise, just to remind ourselves again and again of those connections, and talking about the connections between the climate crisis and the gender justice movements in Canada. So we're interested, of course, in building, and this is a question to you, Yaz, but maybe Amy and Lynette afterwards could add on. We're interested in building stronger connections, right? And convincing people that this is, there's an obvious connection and that we should all be working together on this. So I'd love to hear some of the ideas about how to do that, and especially how to do it. And I'm gonna, maybe refer to the current climate, which can be right now a little bit divisive, and people, really pushing back on certain kinds of analysis, whether it's, denying the need for historical education in the US on critical race, or whether it's about, in Canada, the lack of education on the need for land back or indigeneity, Indigenous sovereignty. Those, there's a lot of resistance to some of the ideas that are critical in what you've mentioned as this is what we have to change. These are the systems we need to change. So I'm just interested about how to bring all of those pieces maybe together, or what are some of the key things we share that hopefully open a way that people can work together more.
No, thanks for that question. I think it is incredibly important. And something like, I think that a lot of community organizations that I'm involved in are thinking about actively, especially like what you saw with the convoy and all these other things, where a whole section of our population was really given a lot of power and energy, right? And so I think I saw the question in the chat too, and just to speak to that too, I hear what you're saying in regards to sometimes making the connections between the climate crisis and, for example, racial justice or Indigenous sovereignty, or talking about it through the lens of capitalism and things like that, can feel like it might isolate folks from the movement. But I would argue that just kind of keeping climate crisis, the climate crisis or the climate movement as very palatable is almost more isolating, because for example, I'll use an example of my community of Rexdale. Like I said, it's like a lower income, like ghettoized community in Toronto. And if I were to go, like when we canvass, for example, and we're to go door to door and asking folks like, ooh, do you care about the Green New Deal? Let's talk about it. No one's gonna listen, first of all. I just need to like be very direct that like, if you are in like the depths of the impacts of like capitalism and all of these systems of oppression, thinking about the climate crisis can feel very like, you can dismiss it because it's just like, I need to get to work. Like you're talking about transportation or like other things, like I'm working, I don't have time to think about these policy changes in this direct way because it's really easy, to like not see the connections, right? In my, like from my experience, and just even talking to folks like my parents and like their friends and those community members. So when we were thinking about ways to engage with folks such as like my neighborhood of Rexdale, which is a highly conservative neighborhood, like when it came to voting, that space or like that region, I don't remember what it's called, but they voted for Doug Ford, right? And so often also when we think about, a Black neighborhood or like a lower income neighborhood, we would be like, I think they'd be voting more liberal or maybe NDP. But when we are looking at actually what's happening, a lot of these neighborhoods are voting conservative. And so that big question mark is like, why is that happening? If you folks will be if we will be the most impacted by these policy changes that are not in favor of our livelihoods, right? So a lot of that is like, just like, again, systemic ignorance of these places. Like there isn't a lot of resourcing in those schools. There isn't a lot of resourcing in those neighborhoods, period. And so when we're thinking about the climate crisis, as we kind of bring in all these other pieces, such as like migrant justice or racial justice, or thinking about the climate justice sphere in regards to transportation and like, how are those things connected? Like in Climate Justice Toronto, which is an organization I've organized with before, we have a whole section, like a whole subgroup on particularly like transportation and just transportation. So I think it's really important to me, the way that I've been moving through this, and a lot of folks have been moving through this movement, is the climate justice space is an umbrella term that kind of holds all of these other justice movements. And that is because no matter what you're fighting for, we are all on this earth. And therefore we will most of us will experience the impacts of the climate crisis. And all these other things are interconnected, because the pandemic in and of itself is a very like simple example to like use as a direct consequence of the climate crisis, right? And so when we think about these things, I think personally, when we start making these interconnections, it brings more people in. Of course, as we do that, there might be folks who are now more resistant to the struggle. But if you would want a good amount of the population dead, I'm not sure I'd want to be organizing with you, right? And thinking about how I think there's a call for inclusivity a lot in our like equity spaces. And I do agree that like we need to do this, but it needs to be like radical inclusivity, right? And so that means that we, again, going back to those trust pieces around like those ecologies of care, a lot of folks who might identify as like conservative, and a lot of folks who might have been at that convoy might not be at that convoy if they understood what they were actually representing, right? But because of the ways in which like these things kind of get construed, it like, and what right-wing politics really do well is bringing everyone in. They're like, oh, you're this, you can be a part of us. Oh, you're there, you can be a part of us. And they might have very opposing like issues, but they'll let you be a part of their movement because they want as much people as they can. I think that is where they succeed really well on the right. And as we think about these more leftist leaning movements, I think what we need to do is move from like, again, that place of like accountability as care. And that means not just canceling people or not just like throwing them or dismissing them, but taking the time to invest in folks like, again, into their understanding, onboarding people into the movement. I think there's like a really, I think there can be this energy that's kind of like, oh, if you don't already understand this, like, then you must be problematic and you must not really want to be here with us. But I think it's thinking about like, oh, 10 years ago, I had no idea about these things, and reminding yourself about like the long process of understanding some of the intricacies of movement spaces and the intricacies of these systemic powers, and taking that time in community to onboard folks, right? And like my dad's still voting conservative, but I'm still having these very, very personal conversations with him every day so that we can kind of start moving that. And so it's thinking about ways that you can invest in folks in your community and bring them in slower, and kind of doing that like community education piece, I think is really, really important. And often you will find that there are actually more interconnected pieces, and it's bringing more people in than isolating them, is what I would say to that. I hope that answers that question.
That's great. Thanks, Yaz. Yaz. Amy and Lynette, is there anything you'd like to add to what Yaz has said?
Yes, it was awesome what you just said. You just took the words out of everybody's mouth. So thank you so much. That's amazing. I think the one thing I would love to see is, and I know that we have to get everybody together and we have to have the conversation, and that is important, but I would love to see some action. I feel that's where my heart is going. So it's like, how do we, once we kind of make that next step, but, really get that together. I just want to see some action. I want us to I always say, get those pieces in place and let's just let it happen. And so that's where my heart is. I just wish we could, because there's so much important things that all of us can do to support each other and support the community. So that's just where my heart goes. So just to concur exactly what Yaz says, but just, that action phase I think is key.
Absolutely. Yes. And that's a great reminder for anybody who's doing, listening in to and thinking about what think about what you can do, having heard so much from the panelists about different possibilities, different solutions, and different actions that you're all taking. There's a question, we have like a couple of minutes, so I'm just going to throw it out there, see if anybody wants to take this on. A question about the nuance between social justice and climate justice. And I find it's a fascinating question. I'm sure there's lots of possible ways to answer. Is there anything that anybody would like to bring out if there is a nuance, or maybe it's more about how the two are intertwined, which I think, Yaz, you mentioned to a certain extent, but maybe there's a little bit of additional context or anything that Amy or Lynette you want to bring in.
I'm happy, or here you go. I was supposed to be I hope one of you go, because
okay. This is more of kind of, I guess, a personal response to that. But when I'm looking at social justice and climate justice, my higher power is definitely in nature. And I think that human beings, I'm sure of this, are a part of nature. And so if we are taking care of ourselves and each other, and we are listening and we are kind, then we're going to be kind to the rest of nature. And the two are ultimately intertwined. And so one really can't exist without the other. That's how I feel about that.
I don't know, Lynette, if you want to go next, if you have something.
I just love what Amy said. To be honest with you, I'm speechless. So no, that was awesome. I really don't have anything else to add. I think it's great what you said, Amy.
Yeah, I think just quickly, I think, exactly what Amy said. And to build just the differences there are just, I think right now it's just kind of getting semantical, climate justice is a social justice is within climate justice. I think they're extremely related and they can't really be broken for the exact reasons Amy mentioned, and that we have all been talking about throughout this panel. I think the only difference that I'm seeing within like the climate justice space is because it is used more as like an umbrella term. It's really talking more about that interconnected piece, where sometimes social justice is kind of like, here's one section on like gender justice, here's one section on racial justice, here's one thing over here. But I think climate justice is really calling on how these are all intersectional and how they're all related, and you can't really break them up. While you can like have a focus area, it all will be that, yeah, there's all that interconnection. So I think that's the only major difference I see, at least right now.
That's wonderful. Thank you all so much. And I'm really enjoying too the comments in the chat and everybody's participation in the conversation. I really appreciate that people are have also reactions to our wonderful panelists. So I'm going to take this moment to thank the panelists, Amy, Lynette, Yaz, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Paulette, for leading us through the conversation and moderating the questions earlier on. And really, thank you to everybody who attended. Thank you, of course, to our Langue des Signes Quebec interpreters and our ASL interpreters. And thank you for both the captioning and the interpretation. And thank you to our team behind the scenes that have made sure that the technology continues to function and that everybody is on the call and able to listen and participate. I really appreciate the opportunity to hear what everybody has said, and to think about how, as Paulette said, we can move ahead on this. It's a critical intersection of climate justice with both gender justice, but gender-based violence in particular. And I think we have a lot of work to do, but I'm very grateful to be doing it with you all. I feel like I've been in a space with some very supportive and great work that we can move together on. So I thank you for your words and your thoughts today.
Thank you.
All the best, everybody. Take care. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Bye now.